I would put music and some audio cues in this intro, but I'm a lazy bastard with an insatiable appetite for thermal paste. Good lord, I hate myself. The following is a review and analysis hybrid of the Fate/stay night visual novel, of which, considering the analysis part, there will be major spoilers, especially in regards to Heaven's Feel. I won't spoil everything, just most of it. If you've never experienced all or any of the routes in Fate/stay night, in visual novel, anime, or in other forms, I suggest you turn away right now if you're sensitive to spoilers. If you've already experienced Fate/stay night, have already been spoiled in one way or another in the past, or simply don't give a shit about spoilers and just want to watch this thing, sit back and grab some popcorn and weed, because this is a long one. You have been warned. How do you define being a fan of something? An odd question to ask at the start of a visual novel review, of course. Regardless, you'll most likely enjoy whatever game, film, TV show, music artist, anime, or even a brand of cookie you like. No one's stopping you from any of that. Unless somebody is actively stopping you, in which case, what an asshole. It should come to no surprise to anyone who's been a longtime viewer of mine, assuming I still have longtime viewers at this point considering how long I've been away, that my main choice of fandom is with Type Moon's Fate franchise, a series which started all the way back in 2004 with the release of the Fate/stay night visual novel, created by Kinoko Nasu and Takashi Takeuchi. As an active follower for the past 7 years, there's no sign that Fate and the broader Nasu-verse as a whole is stopping anytime soon. This train just keeps on rolling. Heaven's Feel Lost Butterfly, and possibly part 3 is coming out next year after all. This series is like herpes. When you think it's gone, it will suddenly come right back to show itself in some fashion. Except I've always said that Fate is the kind of herpes you want to get. Okay, not really, I only just said that, but you get the point. I love Fate, even if it ain't exactly a perfect franchise. I'll admit I'm not a big fan of the Unlimited Blade Works adaptation by Ufotable. Lord knows Fate Collide's a thing, even if I still enjoy that spin-off series. Fate Grand Order's about as far removed from the original groundwork that made Fate into what it is today by essentially turning it into a flashy, Skinnerbox-driven mobile VNRPG waifu collectathon. Yet I still play the game every day anyway. Both the Fate Apocrypha and Fate Extra TV anime exist, and they kinda sucked, and Fate Zero has Gen Urobuchi slathered all over it. Yet it's still one of my favorite anime. And it made me a fan of Fate in the first place. Technically, I started with the 2006 Fate/stay night anime by Studio Dean, but yeah, as predictable as it is, Fate Zero is actually what turned me into the fan that I am. As it did for others, probably. The upside to this is that it totally got me interested in the broader Nasuverse at large, and the over 1,300 pages that populate the Type Moon wiki as we speak, filled to the brim with lore the company's known for, created by people who are undoubtedly hardcore to what is otherwise a niche Japanese IP. It's also these same people who can, if encountered, make being a fan the occasional dick-measuring competition in terms of not only how you got into their precious franchise in the first place, but also how much of it you've experienced or know. As someone who started with the anime, you should know the drill. The visual novel is always what you should start with. Doesn't matter that it's long as hell. If you start any other way, some of the more extreme fans may treat you like filthy secondaries who don't know shit. This is something all fandoms contain. Those who insist you start the old-fashioned and pure way, or not at all. But for once, much to my surprise after reading approximately 800,000 words of occasionally questionable fan translation prose and some gorgeous early Takeuchi CG art, I can actually see where they come from. I've had a lot of time to read through the Fate/stay night visual novel, my first attempt being back in 2014, though I never got around to getting far into it at the time. It wasn't until I was motivated, or rather felt personally challenged enough, to finally give the undertaking a serious attempt in late 2017, finishing it earlier this year. That's what this review is about. A review and analysis of the visual novel from the perspective of a guy who, for the longest time, stuck to the adaptations and finally read where it all began, and promptly appreciated the series more than he ever did because of it. The original Fate/stay night, albeit the real-to-newer version with a patch that comes with extras such as the Vita openings, soundtrack, an uncensor option, and other stuff in my case, is a visual novel about idealism or Okay, that's oversimplifying it by an atom bomb, but idealism does play a major part into it somewhere. It's about numerous things. A slice of life about a high school boy, a wacky comedy, an action-packed thriller with magic and stuff, an exploration of the values of selflessness, the tragedy that could come from believing in your own justice, or even your belief in what constitutes an ideal leader, a potential cautionary tale about never becoming who you perceive to be a hero, a mystery story about unraveling the truth revolving around the purpose of a certain wish-granting device and its history, and a plot that's literally one giant sexual abuse allegory about the difficulties of confronting who is essentially a rape victim. Didn't expect that last bit, huh? That escalated quickly, huh? It begins with a protracted prologue from the perspective of an important supporting main character that establishes the fictional Japanese setting of Fuyuki and the concepts of its urban fantasy world. We are then thrust into the shoes of Shiro Emiya, a teenage high school boy and survivor of a colossal fire disaster when he was young, leaving him orphaned. He's later taken in by the late Kiritsugu Emiya, a magus who saved Shiro from the incident itself, and the boy has since dedicated himself to living up to the heroic ideals the man left behind, giving him a hero complex like no other. Being an amateur magus himself, he lives his life seemingly like normal, with a protective and energetic pseudo-guardian in the form of Taiga Fujimura, Sakura Mato, Shiro's kind, shy, and pretty underclassman who may or may not have a crush on him, and a number of other supporting players of various importance, including Sakura's douchebag older brothers Shinji and Rin Tosaka, the popular girl in school who is secretly a talented magus. Her perspective is what the aforementioned prologue was centered around. It's around here when signs of something grander start to emerge. A series of gas leaks and murders are reported on the news. A silver-haired girl, later introduced to be Elia von Einsburn, shares an ominous threat to kill Shiro when he's walking home. He sees Rin on a random rooftop in the city, and after agreeing to clean the archery dojo for Shinji one day, he witnesses a superhuman battle between two mysterious combatants. He tries to evade their notice, but fails, causing one of them to chase after and nearly kill him with his spear. He somehow manages to survive the encounter due to someone else's intervention and later wakes, heads home, only to once again be targeted by the spear-wielding man when he realizes he's still alive. Shiro is forcefully kicked into his shed and is on the verge of being killed when, suddenly, a mysterious sword-toting female warrior in armor is inadvertently summoned and repels the spearman away through intense combat. She introduces herself as Saber, and that she is his servant, and after finding that Rin is involved in his current predicament, he learns of the Holy Grail War by her and Kirei Kotomine, a priest who works for the church. In this conflict, 7 masters use servants from one of the 7 classes to fight for the Holy Grail, a wish-granting relic, receiving command seals on the body, usually on the arm, that give masters control over them. Those classes being Saber, Lancer, Archer, Rider, Caster, Assassin, and Berserker, each having their own special abilities known as Noble Phantasms. Shiro agrees to fight, but only because he idealistically seeks to end the conflict, not because he wants the Holy Grail itself, and I just realized that this has been the 3rd time I've laid down the plot synopsis of Fate Stay Night since reviewing Fate 2006 all those years ago.
Adapted from one of the 3 storylines in the original visual novel, Fate Stay Night is mainly centered around our protagonist, Shiro. One day, Shiro witnesses a battle where he is seen, and it isn't long before the man that tried to kill him comes back to him and consciously summons a mysterious, awe-inspiring woman in armor, revealed to be in charge of overlooking a magical war. Classes are Saber, Archer, Caster, Berserker,
Rin Tosaka, a young magus whose family, and I just explained the film's setup in 2 paragraphs and 1 sentence. And there's a reason why it only took 2 paragraphs and a sentence.
Unlike the reviews for the anime adaptations, I'm faced with the greater challenge of reviewing the source material considering the length. This is the original rendition of the story, at least it is if you decide to go for the uncensored version, but Real Tenua, the all-ages re-release, can count as well. It's essentially a scenario where the task of tackling a familiar premise is suddenly made new again. All 800,000 words of it. So, where to begin? Fate Stay Night should be basic fare if you're familiar with even your most average visual novel in terms of structure. There are 3 story routes, each spanning over several in-novel days, days being equivalent to chapters, with distinct storylines and even respective love interests. The Fate route is for Saber, Unlimited Blade Works is for Rin, and Heaven's Feel is for Sakura, each path containing different conflicts, and even select characters you won't even meet in the other routes, like Zoken Mato. Choices play a big part, and if you choose the wrong one, it's game over. in ways that are kind of a treat in of themselves. The scenarios in which Shiro can totally screw up and doom himself often have a surprising amount of buildup and detail put into them that it's almost a reward to read as many of them as you can anyway, intentionally or not. They even have good variety. While most lead to Shiro's death, the reasons aren't always the same, and some bad ends can lead to special outcomes. Like for example, having his soul transferred into a doll, being consumed by darkness, or being possessed and turned into a mind slave. It's usually a rule to avoid bad ends as you go along, but in this case, I'd actually recommend checking each one out. They even come with these segments called the Taiga Dojo, where Taiga and Ilya essentially tell you hints on how to avoid each bad end, often in an upbeat and heavily comedic fashion full of references, slapstick, and you have a Chibi-rin who smokes a cigarette and drives a goddamn pink lowrider. They're the cherry on top. It doesn't matter that Shiro just had his organs spill out of him or that his entire body broke. The Taiga Dojos will often do their own thing regardless, and it is glorious. I'm going to go through each route one at a time, though it's important to note that the Fate route is considered the first route in the novel, and for good reason. It serves as the introduction to the world itself beyond the initial prologue, the central conflict of Shiro's character, the dynamics of the supporting cast, and to facilitate the romantic development between our red-haired protagun and my goddamn waifu, and all the drama it leads to. Though the original 2004 release presents each route in linear order, Real Tenua for PC allows you to play the routes in any order you want, though it's not recommended. The true order should be Fate route first, then Blade Works, then Heaven's Feel. In fact, you can think of the three routes as a sort of progression of Shiro's underlying character arc and development of our cast in general, as each route features its own method of showing you just who exactly these people are. Shiro's idealism, however, is the centerpiece of its overall focus as you go through it. Fate brings up his ideals and serves as an in-between when tackling the subject. Blade Works explores and questions it, and Heaven's Feel grabs it by the balls and throws it to the curb. It's all in service to fleshing out Shiro as a character, and to explore the ambiguous morality of this urban fantasy world. The Fate route is about the bond between Shiro and Saber. It's also about their flaws and their wills, told through a story that is quite possibly the most upbeat and clear-cut out of all three, which is likely the intention. If the premise is teenage boy summons a powerful servant and engages in a battle royale for a magical super cup, Fate is the route that strays from this setup the least. In fact, the battle royale is the overarching focus of the plot through the majority until much later, where twists and turns occur that change all of that. Whether it be the intense fights, comedy, drama, and everything else in between, it plays things fairly straight as far as the novel is concerned. Shiro and Saber even go on a date. A comically lame date that's funny on one hand, but is also important to the plot. It wouldn't be a stretch to say the Fate route is the most slice of life out of the whole visual novel, in fact, and this direction dictates how most characters are fleshed out. Each route provides new information about who these characters are as you progress through the entire novel, like taking off layers upon layers of clothing. But considering Fate is the introduction, we only really get the base elements of their characteristics besides Shiro and Saber, who are a major focus. Rin is the feisty, smart magical prodigy who's talented, courageous, and serves as a dispenser of much of the exposition regarding how the magic of this world works. Ilya, when she isn't trying to kill our main cast, is a devious little girl with a strong connection to her berserker, has lived a sheltered upbringing in a castle, and is ignorant of Japanese culture. Kirei is a seemingly noble but questionable priest who looks over the Grail War. Shinji's an asshole. Sakura is kinda there. Taiga is a source of comedy relief, and so on. The ease of access, plot and character-wise, is meant to capture the basic dynamics our characters share, as well as to allow the legroom to exposit a lot about the magic and concepts of the world. This is a route where comedic slice-of-life moments allow the cast to express themselves the most, free from the drama that is present and accounted for at key points, and to allow the reader to get fully accustomed to the perspective Fate Stay Night is mostly told with, Shiro's perspective. That bit is probably the biggest difference going from the anime adaptations to this, a shift I greatly underestimated. Fate primarily utilizes a first-person narrative that dives into the head of certain characters. It mainly focuses on Shiro's perspective, as I said, but it can occasionally change to different characters when need be. The shift is actually more major than one would think, and made me realize, in an eye-widening manner, that the anime adaptations, regardless of where they hail from, never came close to capturing the minds of our characters the same way this approach is capable of, with the possible exception of Fate 2006, as I'll explain much later on. It also revealed that some of my opinions, to my own surprise, may have been misconceptions the entire time.
Ever explored. It's just, hey, my dad told me to be good, so I'll be good. Essentially staying the same from beginning to end. You know this guy's gonna be the same no matter what, and man, he's so bland, he makes a whiteboard look complex.
Shiro is not a bland character. The realization hit me like Movie Bob hits a Princess Peach Dakimakura around the later portions of the Fate route. Up to this point, we've gotten to learn just how much Shiro does think about the actions he takes, and why he does it in a way the animes just never did or couldn't do. The clear benefit of being a text-based medium is to take however long you need to explain things, and where anime Shiro is usually portrayed as a brash, idiotic, inconsiderate, and borderline insufferable goody two-shoes, the unfortunate truth is that the adaptations absolutely fail in capturing his mindset to truly outline and explore his psyche and make the viewers understand his actions, something the visual novel does in spades. Fellow YouTuber Daniel, aka Shintai Reviews, made an excellent video about this topic, and I do recommend you check him and the video out for yourself, but suffice to say, the Shiro we know in the anime is not the Shiro we get to know in the visual novel as a result of this difference. Anime Shiro is a generic, idealistic anime protagonist who says or shouts that he'll never give up and fight you if you tell him to do so. Visual novel Shiro is an idealistic, traumatized, psychologically troubled teenage boy with little to no self-worth, has to actively convince himself that he's moved on from his past, and feels like it's his purpose to help people because it's literally his only reason to live that he has left in the world. An empty husk of a man who can only find purpose and feel like a human being when helping others, caring little for whether he lives or dies as a result. Technically speaking, anime Shiro and visual novel Shiro are identical characters and act more or less the same way. The difference, however, is the perspective in which he's characterized, and the novel goes into Shiro's mind far more than any of the animes can, and that fact fully came to me when he has a huge fit of full-fledged PTSD laden to the Fate route. Nasu doesn't hold back in this department either. He really wants to hammer just how much Shiro can't seem to live with himself if he doesn't uphold his selfless ideals, and how much it tears him apart if he fails, not only here, but in the other routes as well. He's filled to the brim with survivor's guilt to the point where he barely feels like a person most of the time. Ideals from a dying man ended up shaping his personality to the point where the ideals have become the man. He even projects his ideals onto Saber, not wanting her to get hurt in battle, even though getting hurt is to be expected of servants. He'll risk his life to protect her wherever he can, and boy does it lead to some shitty outcomes. Guy can come off as borderline misogynistic sometimes as well. But it's only because he wants to protect her.
あいつが逃げるなんてめったにないから。しかし、そうか。道連れ
Shiro Emiya, teenage boy, helper of mankind. Casual misogynist. This is also a purpose of the Fate route, to establish who Shiro is for when you move onto the other routes, since it's this guy who will be tested the most out of all the characters. Shiro is an embodiment and, later on, an explorative deconstruction of the selfless Captain America type hero character, and the novel makes it a point to test him in more ways than one as you go along. In the case of the Fate route, however, it chooses to take the middle ground when it comes to this, what with it being the introduction to the rest of Fate's Day Night. After all, Saber is center stage here, and what we have is a full-on romance about two damaged people who heal each other, metaphorically and sometimes literally, and find their own way of moving on from their troubled pasts. There's more to the plot than this, from the establishment of character bonds with Rin and Ilya, both of whom play bigger roles in the other routes, to the exploration of this world's magic. At the end of the day, though, it's the romance itself that leads to not only the primary source of character growth in Fate, but proves to be the anchor of its overall themes. It's a shame the relationship between Shiro and Saber has, since then, been boiled down to cool guy who's good at cooking and stuff, and cute, petite, blonde-haired female warrior who loves to eat a lot and can fight and stuff, in the contemporary Fate fandom zeitgeist if that Shiro cooking anime and fan art are any indication. I'd opine that the romance between Shiro and Saber in Fate's Day Night may just be the most positive relationship and second most thematically rich in terms of what it represents. No, I'm not being biased when I say that just because Saber's my waifu either. Their entire bond and how it progresses is one big character arc for both. What starts as a love at first sight for Shiro turns into dramatic conflict that delves into the vulnerabilities and hypocrisies born from their respective motivations, as he looks past the idealistic noble figure and finds the damaged person underneath. Their arcs then are about reconciling their conflict where one wants to undo the past while the other wants the other to move beyond it, much to his own contradictions. Saber, who's later revealed to be King Arthur, is a figure of great tragedy, her own ideals of what constitutes a rightful king backfiring upon rebellion and bloodshed, and seeks the Grail to undo the selection of her title and have someone else be king. By doing this, she hopes that it'll prevent the same ruin that was brought about when she was king, which is noble in principle in a way. If her ideals brought about downfall, why not avoid it entirely? Make someone else be king, and maybe they'll do a better job. However, this mindset of hers has a flaw that raises more questions. How would she know that any other king wouldn't rule Camelot in a similar, if not in a worse way? Is it even guaranteed that her kingdom wouldn't turn to ruin anyway? Better yet, isn't she just giving someone else her responsibility, and would that other king end up like her eventually? When positioned this way, the nobility of her wish, her hope to avoid ruin by changing history, is contradicted by a kind of selfishness that Saber doesn't seem to realize for most of the plot. Shiro, of course, finds issue with this, especially when he falls even more in love with her later on. The fact that she wishes to rid of her problems and give it to someone else to endure strikes a chord, and fueled by his love and ideals, strives to convince her to move on from her past. The hypocrisy is quite clear, however. As you read through the novel, it's apparent to the reader, and even Saber herself, that Shiro hasn't moved on from his own past either. It continues to dictate his present, and it's evident that his ideals could very well lead to his own ruin, much like how Saber's did. It makes the two inverses of each other in a way. One's idealism led to tragedy, the other's tragedy led to idealism. This is essentially the crux of the conflict within their bond, not because one of them is right, but because both are selfish. Even if Saber does undo the selection of the king, it won't change the fact that she is simply going to give someone else her responsibility and eventual suffering. But even if Shiro convinces her to move on, accept her past failure, and live for herself with him, happiness may not be guaranteed considering her regrets. It's even revealed that Saber is not like the other heroic spirits summoned in the Grail War. Unlike the others, she's not simply a spiritual copy of King Arthur. She's the actual King Arthur, in the past and in a near-death state, spawning and dying every time there's an opportunity to obtain the Grail in different time periods. Her soul literally time travels to different points in time when summoned as a servant, and when she is killed, it returns to her body in the past, where she is dying, and is fated to go through this process over and over until her wish is granted. In other words, she can't actually die until she obtains the Grail. The novel sorta leaves it open to a fascinating implication that Saber might have potentially been summoned beyond her appearances in both Fate's Day Night and Fate Zero, possibly to alternate timelines as well, which do exist in the Nasuverse, though this isn't actually confirmed in the novel itself. Regardless, how could Shiro put an end to her efforts, considering how long she's spent and how much she's done trying to achieve her wish, without it feeling like said effort was all for naught? It's only when they truly come together, notably against the King of Heroes Gilgamesh, and work toward a common goal that they both begin to realize there's more to their lives than what they want or believe in. One of my favorite details about the Fate route is the existence of Avalon itself, Saber's long-lost scabbard that appears in the later part of the second act, which not only plays a vital role in the plot for being the source of both characters' regenerative healing abilities, it's symbolic for their relationship as a whole. Avalon's power doesn't activate unless Saber is near it, and since it's embedded within Shiro by Kiritsugu, explaining how he managed to survive the fire incident in his past, she literally can't heal her body without Shiro and vice versa. And this literal function comes to symbolize the metaphorical aspect of their relationship. They need each other, not simply to heal their bodies, but to heal their very souls by finding something new in one another to strive for, not by themselves, but together. Saber learns through Shiro that there's more to life than kingship, duty, and her own failures, while Shiro finds a new reason to live his life through Saber. He wants to give her a happy life, and when the Grail is revealed to have been corrupted by Angraminyu, the embodiment of all the world's evil which seeks to destroy everything if it comes into existence, the lessons they learn kick into high gear. Saber's motives would have been impossible anyway, but her motives to undo her past have already left. There is only going forward. They're lost and left broken when alone. It's by being together that they are able to face adversity both within and outside of themselves, overcoming their own flaws and their enemies, and I think that's a great message to have when dealing with a romance like this. It's what defines the Fate route overall. The themes of overcoming personal flaws, not alone, but as a team, is what makes the bond between Shiro and Saber resonate in such a positive light like no other pairing does in the novel. It's not simply about two characters becoming better as people, it's two people filling the empty spaces within their very beings, strengthening their will and outlook on life. With Real Tenua, they even added what is easily the most beautiful epilogue I've ever looked at and read, and it's exclusive only to that version of the novel. As an introduction, the Fate route has comedy, drama, and all the twists and turns that make a good mystery, but it also provides a tale that could very well stand on its own as being something genuinely powerful. A story of master and servant that ends with two people who find what they've been missing the entire time. Of course, this is only 1/3 of Fate Stay Night, and the second intended route, in a sizable regard, seeks to shake things up. Unlimited Blade Works is a natural evolution from Fate's relatively straightforward morality, no longer letting it slide, but actively questioning Shiro and his ideals. Where Fate is defined by the very bond Shiro and Saber share through their interactions, conflict, eventual reconciliation, and the overcoming of their weaknesses, Blade Works is defined by conflict, not between two people with selfish motives, but by two who oppose each other. In this case, it's Shiro against Shiro. While certain characters like Saber and Ilia take a back seat in terms of characterization, others are given the spotlight, including those we never really got to see, such as Soichiro Kusuki, and certain characters who were previously introduced but weren't focused on are given greater attention, notably Rin, Archer, Shinji, Caster, and even Lancer to some extent. The tone is also notably darker, though it's not without moments of levity and slice-of-life elements carried from the preceding route. The plot makes the war a pervasive element, for sure, but there's enough free time for our cast to, say, go on a group date or go to school, though that doesn't remain the case for long. Blade Works is definitely the more matured middle chapter of the Fate Stay Night saga, but clearly maintains a light heart where it counts. The shift in tone doesn't simply become evident in how it feels to read or what happens within the plot, however. It's representative of the next step the novel goes toward exploring Shiro himself. Fate was clear-cut and easy to follow. Blade Works is where the jump in complexity takes place. Unlike Fate, there are multiple parties at center stage. Initially, it's Shiro, Saber, Rin, and Archer in the first group, Shinji and Rider in second, Caster and Soichiro in third, Ilia and Berserker in fourth. What makes the narrative comparatively dynamic and intriguing compared to Fate is that the parties shift throughout the story. It isn't too long before Ilia and Berserker are wiped out and the structure becomes Shiro and Rin in first, Caster, Soichiro, Saber, and Archer in second, Shinji and Gilgamesh in third, and you get the idea as the parties continue to shift further. As a result of this dynamic narrative of shifting parties, Blade Works utilizes more twists and double crosses than Fate ever did, having less of a mystery element where something is hidden in shadow to be unraveled, but instead aspires to go for the thriller-oriented side of Fate Stay Night. Twists that change paradigms, create new relationships, surprise the reader, and has a heavy dose of action in between it all. I can now see a part of the reason why Ufotable chose to adapt Unlimited Blade Works after Fate Zero instead of starting with the Fate route. Where Fate is a mystery, slice-of-life romance novel, albeit with a thematically charged and powerful romantic arc, Blade Works is this action-packed, suspenseful, morally ambiguous thriller novel with all the twists and turns, spectacle, and the frills you may come to expect from Fate's Day Night, which clearly plays to their strengths more than a story built upon drama, comedy, romance, and dump trucks full of expository dialogue. If all of that is what you want out of Fate, this route is clearly for you. I'd argue that Bladeworks is the most action-heavy, though not for the sake of it. Some are for the sake of raising the stakes of the plot, or to expound a revelation that adds a new element into the mix, such as when our main cast find out that Soichiro, who was previously believed to be a regular school teacher, is actually a fully trained, cold-blooded, deadly assassin man who knows advanced martial arts and is augmented by Caster to be quick and strong as fuck, even outmatching Saber in close quarters combat. One of the bad endings in this encounter literally has Rin having her entire head punched off as if it were a bag of jello.
ちょっとそこまでシロを殺しに。
Of course, there's the primary conflict that defines Unlimited Blade Works, Shiro's ideals and how it questions them, and the way it does so is by critiquing them, which is where Archer comes into play. Unlike Fate, where Archer was the cynical, mysterious, yet helpful and ultimately selfless supporting character, he's a major player in not only Shiro's arc, but is even given somewhat of an arc of his own. He is, by and large, the antithesis to Shiro, not because he opposes his ideals, but because his ideals are the same. In fact, Archer is actually Shiro from the future in a parallel timeline. Why does this guy like Archer, who is essentially Shiro and possesses his own ideals, an antagonistic figure in the route? The difference is while Shiro is a possessor of the ideals of his late adopted father, Archer is the practitioner, the result of Shiro's ideals. This is where the exploration of heroism, the route, if not the entirety of Fate's Day Night, truly begins. Archer represents a future where Shiro actively puts his ideals into action, saving people as much as he can, going as far as to create a pact with the planet itself to become what is known as a counter-guardian, a being who opposes evil wherever it comes from, at any point in time it arrives, fated to kill those who seek to create chaos over and over. Technically speaking, this is what Shiro's ideals are about, stopping evil and saving the innocent. Even after being killed by those he wanted to save, Archer kept his ideals going through the pact he made with the world. The problem is that this method of achieving this ideal, the method of continuously stopping evil through force and bloodshed throughout time, eventually led to the disillusionment of his ideals, that no matter how many people he killed, evil just kept springing up again, and again, in a seemingly endless cycle of bloodshed. He wanted to save people, and though he killed many evils to save the many, it just never ended. Archer is the fulfillment of the potential ruin Shiro could very well face by his ideals, much like Saber and how her ideals led to her own ruin, and that very same man wants to kill his other, younger self, not because he hates him, but because he wants to prevent such ruin from happening in the first place. In a twisted, cynical way, Archer's motives are inherently noble in that he wants to save himself, his other self, from the pain of realizing that there will always be pain, misery, and evil in the world. Shiro, being the person he is, goes through the ringer, not only physically through fighting, but morally, mentally, philosophically. He doesn't want to give up on his ideals, and Archer knows this, and that's what creates the conflict, and most of all, the big question presented in Unlimited Blade Works. Can Shiro's ideology work in a world as ambiguous as the one he lives in right now? It's a question with multiple layers. One of those layers presents itself when the other moral conflict in the story begins to heat, which is the relationship between Shiro and Rin. The boiled down version of their dynamic is, while Shiro is the idealist, Rin is the realist, having lost her family in the past like Shiro did. Both being orphans is already something the two can relate with. Where it gains traction, however, is when Rin begins to realize what kind of person Shiro really is. A damaged man with a skewed outlook on himself and how he lives his life. Through the deaths of his parents, biological or adopted, Shiro gains ideals and a way to live his life as this husk of a person who wants to do good things to make himself feel purposeful. Rin, on the other hand, has only looked out for herself when her parents died, to keep her own life at the forefront of her priorities and to live up to the Tosaka lineage. Someone like Shiro can only baffle her. His selfless nature, his willingness to put his life on the line when need be, how he views himself as someone who exists purely for these things. It's something that makes Rin irritated initially, but as Shiro's character grows more exposed and she learns about the man, it turns into concern for his well-being. Not least of which is the revelation that she actually has a bit of a crush on him already, and vice versa, actually. Her past didn't make her want to strive to save people like Shiro. If anything, it only made her want to continue living even more. What gives her added dimension is, despite her ideology of looking out for herself and what she stands for as, more or less, the last member of the Tosaka family, Rin is inherently a good person. Maybe even selfless in her own right. She displayed these attributes in the Fate route, whether to teach Shiro some of her knowledge about magic, offer some magic training, and to risk her life in not only the battle with Berserker, but also the kidnapping of Ilia. The part of her that does merciful or selfless actions can be seen in Blade Works as well, when Shiro and Rin fight each other in the school. She's willing to let Shiro live, but only if he gives up his command seals, which is said to be unusual when it comes to magi, and even offers to heal his wound after taking Ryder's large nail to the arm, saving her life, defining her as someone who isn't ruthless and cold-blooded, with an honor system to boot. She even tries to save an innocent student after said student had some of her life force drained by Ryder during the whole fight, willing to let certain things go to help others on occasion. But as a major focus, the route also lays down the side of Rin that tries to see the world for what it is, and that, at the end of the day, she has to do what she can to survive and win the Grail War, to always put value in her own life. After all, it is her duty to do so for her family name. So Blade Works now has two parallel conflicts going on within. The ideological conflict of Shiro and Archer, and the human conflict of Shiro and Rin. Suffice to say, Rin's character arc is one of growth through Shiro. It's not so much that she receives new traits that positively impact who she is. Those traits already exist, as I previously said. What she does learn throughout her arc, by Shiro's example, is to have more faith and value in selfless acts. An arc that improves the traits she already has, but typically holds back, becoming a better person even to the point of risking her own life to save Shinji despite what he's done by the end. As character arcs go in the novel, Rin in Unlimited Blade Works definitely has one of the more transformative arcs throughout. Less complicated than her arc in Heaven's Feel, but more fleshed out and palpable than in Fate, where she doesn't really have much of one considering her role as a supporting character. But notice that I've been talking about Rin's arc. What about Shiro? Does he have a direct character arc? The answer is that he actually doesn't change much in Blade Works, and it ends by leaving it open as to whether he's learned anything or not. That's typically a bad thing in storytelling. A character without a transformative arc doesn't lend itself well most of the time, though that's just basic storytelling 101. Shiro at the beginning is pretty much the Shiro at the end, and I'd fault it if him not changing much didn't serve a purpose. What arc Shiro has is about sticking to your beliefs. Yes, he doesn't actually undergo any real change, but certain people around him do, Rin especially, and the conflict of ideals with Archer is to compound his unwillingness to give it all up. His arc is minimal because the novel is testing his character, not only to the reader, but to the other characters and how it affects them. Fate took the middle ground. This route makes it a point to display his will and convictions under heavier adversity. If there's any obstacle in the road for everyone involved, it's Gilgamesh. I never really talked about him during the section about Fate because his purpose there was fairly straightforward. In Fate, he served as a romantic counterpoint to Shiro, in terms of who he is and the fact that he wants Saber for himself as well. He basically represents what Shiro would be if he was a total douchebag, not caring for who Saber is as a person or anything else about who she is, wanting her, essentially, because she gives him blue balls, which I know that's boiling it down, but in a way that's pretty much true. Or in other words, in the most super duper distilled half-joking manner possible, Shiro's the incel, while Gilgamesh is the Chad. Gilgamesh in Unlimited Blade Works, however, takes on a completely different role. He's a counter to both Shiro and Archer alike in terms of ideology, as well as being a major antagonist for the route as a whole, unlike Fate or Heaven's Feel. In a way, he's one of those evils Archer is sworn by the world to eliminate, and a cynical version of what Shiro stands for. A powerful adversary who wants to bring despair to the world because it's how the world works in his eyes. There could be no growth in humanity without suffering, the kind Shiro seeks to prevent. As antagonists go, I wouldn't find Gilgamesh in Blade Works to be a fascinating villain on his own, his motivations being kinda generic by itself and can be argued to be a weak point when positioned this way. It's when contextualized by the greater themes of the story, however, that it makes sense, since it correlates with Shiro's overall arc, not necessarily here, but the novel in general. If anything, what I consider to be the weakest aspect of Unlimited Blade Works is, and I know this will be unpopular, Shiro and Rin's relationship. I know I said good things about it earlier, as Rin's arc is a strong one and I have good to say about it later on. It's the rest of the relationship that doesn't quite click with me the same way Shiro had with Saber. Fate made the relationship and the message of it interwoven. It's basically about two people overcoming personal weaknesses and working together to go against the odds, to change into better people. Blade Works has the message of its relationship be of a comparatively simplified quality about valuing selflessness, compassion, and to be more optimistic about the future, with Archer telling Rin to make sure Shiro doesn't end up like him, and she vowing to do so at the end. Where Shiro and Saber learn something new or attain something new by being together and rise above obstacles at the end, Rin just learns to better embrace a side of her that isn't selfish because of Shiro's example. They're both good romances with good arcs, it's just that Fate's romance represented something much more powerful and, well, more romantic. The Fate route even has Shiro kissing Saber to signify romance, something that doesn't happen in Blade Works with Rin. By comparison, the most romantic thing Shiro and Rin do is sit together back to back and talk about themselves and how they feel and think, and they act more like they're friends with obvious crushes with each other than people falling in love. Love isn't the point of the route, I know, but it doesn't quite strike the same level of emotional connection this way, even if the message can still be a good one. I didn't intend to offend any fans of the Shiro and Rin pairing. After all, these are my thoughts and I'm open to alternative readings. I just personally don't see how it's any better than the romance with Saber. Besides, I suppose I went on too long about it anyway and should probably move on by saying that Unlimited Blade Works, while my least favorite route in the novel, is still a pretty damn good story in its own right. I'd even say it's better than what Ufotable did with their adaptation, going for a more straight-to-the-point approach, rather than having the tendency of bloating things out for too long. The confrontation Shiro and Archer have at Einsburn Castle should not have taken 2.5 episodes to resolve. The visual novel is much more focused and represents the route in its purest, less padded form. As a middle chapter, you couldn't really ask for a better one. I previously brought up the route's central question. Can Shiro's ideology even work in a world as ambiguous as the one he lives in right now? Rin's arc is the answer, and it says that, no, it can't, but not as the world is now. If how he impacted Rin is any indication, it's not a matter of applying his selfless ideology to the world at large, but to inspire others to value the lessons said ideology can bring. If enough people valued selflessness and the same goodwill Shiro believes in, like how it influenced Rin throughout the story, maybe then could the world Archer fought for be a possibility, however unlikely it may be. The romance isn't the best, but the message means well and ultimately makes for a damn good route from beginning to the optimistic end. It's only fitting, then, that the best was saved for last. Before moving on, I must say that I've been neglecting an aspect of Fate's Stay Night that, for hardcore fans, cannot be ignored, but for good reason. Mostly. You see, the original 2004 release of Fate's Stay Night wasn't simply this action-packed, 800,000-word epic that tackled mature and philosophical subject matters about heroism, trauma, love, and morality in a Japanese teenage high school slice-of-life urban fantasy lens. It also kinda doubled as porn.
Saber's voice feels good. Her slender arms and legs and her inside walls feel so good that I can die in it.
Ah. I see. I'm filled with Shiro.
I block her hand with my forehead and lick her pretty belly button. My dick begins its last expansion.
Ow, it is expanding.
Saber's body jumps at the pressure of expansion. I've ejaculated half my organs after all. What human could move after such a feat? My cum drips down her mouth as she cannot drink all of it. It must be painful, but Saber tries hard to drink my cum and soothes my burning heat.
This is Shiro's smell.
I pull my boiling meat out of the hole that has been contracting to push me out.
I'm like a dog. This feels good.
My tongue is too small compared to what entered her before. I bet something this small is more appropriate for Saber's small hole, though.
Shiru is licking my dirty area.
The scent of woman fills the air.
Yes, the rumors are true. While Fate Stay Night rises above its roots, it's something hard to overlook when you're deep into this series as I and others are.
Her soft meat tightens around my tip, my shaft, and my whole penis. The sensation is so overwhelming that it makes me want to explode my brains out as well.
Yes, Fate Stay Night had full-on sex scenes for each route, and they are so not the point of this franchise. Hell, the reasons for why these characters have sex is questionable in the first place. Did you know that bodily fluids and hair hold magical energy in the Nasuverse? Because they do. Sex gives Saber magical power, sex allows Rin to transfer her magic to Shiro. It's the key to everything in this universe. Good thing there isn't a scene where Shiro pees on anyone. That would be a really awkward method of transferring his magical energy. It's awkward to say this out loud, for fuck's sake.
I hear her gore in and quickly pull myself back.
It's so sticky, huh? Shiro's is spilling away.
It's clear the sex scenes of the original release were made to appeal to a niche, hence why, when compared to the greater plots at hand, it comes across as more of an afterthought for the most part. The scenes themselves aren't exactly a reference for what good writing is. It tries to go for eroticism, but lands on being fucked up slapstick comedy instead.
My pre-cum blends with Tosaka's love juice. Our movements create bubbles between us.
But Saber, if you do it like this, Shiro will be in pain as well. We have to get it so wet that even your butt is wet.
The pain stuffing my meat is like an awkward caress, and it drives me nuts.
It tastes so good. Your sperm is so strong that it tickles.
The Real Tenua re-release for the PS2 and later on for PC would get rid of these scenes. It can even be argued that Real Tenua is actually a superior experience as far as Fate and Bladeworks are concerned, as they add different scenes that actually make for some of the best moments of the visual novel.
Her anus is defenseless.
Regardless of what version you choose to read, you're getting the same story either way. That is, except for Heaven's Feel.
Moshi 私が悪い人になったら許せませんか？
ああ、桜が悪いことをしたら怒る。きっと他のやつより何倍も怒ると思う。よか
った。先輩にならいいです。先輩が思ってるような女の子じゃないんですよ。それを邪魔するのが楽しくしてるじゃない。お前は犯罪者の息子は間違いない。離れて分かってたのに、おじい様に逆らうこと、自分で終わらせることもできなかった。それでも私が悪い。それでも助けてたかった。先輩との時間をこれからも守っていたかった。
もう泣くな。桜が悪いやつだってことはよく分かったから。だから俺が守る。どんなことになっても、桜自身が桜を殺そうとしても、俺が桜を守るよ。
I'm going to say it right here. Heaven's Feel is my favorite route, and chances are that I'm not the only one who shares this opinion. It's typically hailed as being the best by the visual novel's fans, and after reading it for myself, I saw why. It's easily the darkest, the most ambiguous, the most horrifying, and the most complex. Not to mention that getting a game over in Heaven's Feel is almost as easy as sneezing. Seriously. There are plenty of ways Shiro can fail here. It's also the route where I recommend the uncensored original version of the story, as the Real Tenua rendition downplays important elements, if not changes elements outright. Reading it censored has nowhere near the same punch. But what makes Heaven's Feel such an amazing route is also what makes it the most difficult to talk about. If you favored certain characters, Heaven's Feel could change your mind on them. If you disliked certain characters, you could very well view them in a new light. If you thought you knew who some of these people are, you've only scratched the surface. If you thought you knew everything, It turns out there's more. After going through the motions in previous routes, Sakura finally gets her turn as the primary love interest and is a major focus for the story beyond romance. She was pretty much a supporting character who didn't really have much presence and little in the way of relevance. The realization that this may have been intentional never dawned on me, even up to the point where I first started the route. Of course, continuing the progression of character development all across the novel, the other characters are given attention as well, to varying degrees as usual, but in unexpected ways. If Fate was stage 1 and Blade Works was stage 2, Heaven's Feel is the third and final stage in the novel's general development of characters as players both pre-established or entirely exclusive to this route enter the fray. From the nefarious Soken Mato, Sakura and Shinji's quote-unquote grandfather who serves as one of the route's antagonists, True Assassin, Zoken's shadowy skull mask servant who's revealed to be the real assassin of this Grail War with an ominous, unpredictable nature to him, to the pre-established Rider, who was originally Shinji's lackey but now serves an actual importance here, given time to be fleshed out and understood by our main cast, and is tied to the greater conflict ahead. But the character that most surprised me in terms of how much development is received would be Ilia, who's given a more active role in the plot this time around in both practical and personal ways. I'll talk about her in due time, but if you are already a fan of Ilia, or better yet, if you didn't like Ilia at all before, there are reasons to like her here. Surprises are plenty in Heaven's Feel, actually, which also presents a bit of a problem on my end. It's best to go into Heaven's Feel blind, which is counterintuitive for this video since it's a review and analysis of the original Fate Stay Night visual novel and the experience of going through it. Despite the initial spoiler warning, having to spoil Heaven's Feel to any real degree isn't something I like to do, but to talk about the plot in any real depth does require it, more so than the other routes. Maybe it'd be best to turn off this video now, and maybe save yourself from the spoilers if you aren't spoiled already, especially since the film trilogy is still ongoing. As said at the beginning, you have been warned. If you're still here, well, here I go. This is gonna be a long one. Heaven's Feel is the finale of Shiro's arc, and boy, does it kick his ass. Steeped to the brim with dramatic weight and hopelessness at its corners, this is easily the most allegorical of all the routes because, much to my shock, this story is actually about sexual abuse when you look between the lines and boil it down, which is unheard of up until this point. Going through Fate and Blade Works, I was taught to expect subject matter much more straightforward than this, considering the overall Battle Royale setup. The moment I began to realize just how much of a departure Heaven's Feel was compared to what I was used to, both in the novel and even the animes, was when Sakura starts displaying signs of a mysterious illness and faints in the bathroom on day 5.
I hold Sakura up in my arms. Her body is soft and surprisingly hot. She doesn't seem to be conscious, but she's moaning in pain. Her hand grabs her chest, as if wanting to take her shirt off. She gasps. This is way too much for me. Her body is soft, and her hair is unraveled. Her shirt is the only thing between my arms and her body, and this isn't the Sakura I know. Her shirt sticks to her body and emphasizes her large breasts, and I can't take my eyes off of them. Her breasts move up and down along with her breasts, exposing her white neck. It feels like my heart will leap out of my chest. My head wouldn't be this hot even if I drank a love potion. I realize my mouth is watering, and I swallow with great difficulty. Her beautiful lips make my head go wild. Her body is so hot and soft that it makes me imagine how good it must taste. My head goes blank. It's not a girl's body I'm holding, but a woman's. This isn't the Sakura I know. Then, it shouldn't be a problem if I hold her a little.
That's when it truly dawned on me that, with the first-person perspective and its tendency to flesh out Shiro's mind, Heaven's Feel also intended to explore a different side to him that the other routes downplayed. The fact that he's a teenage boy with raging hormones. Oh god. While it's easy to imagine a scenario where Fate Stay Night turns into a sex comedy the likes American Pie could only dream of being, anyone who knows this novel, or indeed this series, is aware that nothing is that simple in this universe. The novel makes this aspect of Shiro a point going forward, as the greater themes and implications are shed alight more and more. I sure got caught off guard by just how sexually charged this route was, and when you thought some of the horror elements were a tad surprising previously, Heaven's Feel makes Nasu's ability to write horror front and center. This route is his canvas. His prose, regardless of the fan translation's actual quality, manages to shine through. He really loves detailing every last crevice of horrific imagery during these scenes, leading to some truly disturbing descriptions and psychologically twisted monologues that make any of the past dips into horror look tame. He's really good at setting an ominous tone to his horror, and how to intensify it when everything starts going even more wrong than it had before. It makes me wish he'd write a full-fledged horror visual novel. It's really that good. Sex and horror are elements that are of significant existence in Heaven's Feel. Even early on, long before the story heats the fever pitch, these elements make for quite an impression. It was so strange to me when Taiga just casually brings up Sakura's bust size and teases Shiro with it. Up to this point, you actually got the impression that she wanted to keep him away from that sort of mindset, to prevent him from getting too close to our female cast in that way. She'd go as far as having any female cast member sleep in a separate room, far away from him. Now, she deliberately teases Shiro with how sexy he must think Sakura is, as if wanting them to be a couple, creating this comedic gag out of it because Sakura hears all this and it leads to sexual tension that is just out of place in the context of what came before. But Heaven's Feel ain't what came before. You could even say that this is all part of the plan, so to speak. We are in the final chapter of this entire novel, so to hit home all the fastballs and curveballs are what it's all about in regards to exploring our protagonist. And explore it does. Where Shiro met a middle ground in fate and was able to fight for his beliefs and stick to them in Bladeworks, Heaven's Feel is where those ideals meet reality, and god damn, does this story hate him. Not only does he lose more than he gains, he has a proverbial knife stuck in his back that's sliding down as it goes along. I previously said that Shiro is, quote-unquote, an explorative deconstruction of selfless hero characters like Captain America or other characters of that sort, particularly those that come from anime or manga. You know, your generic shonen protagonist who will never give up and fight. This statement, the statement of saying Shiro is a deconstruction, is not true going through Fate and Unlimited Bladeworks, but is totally in effect in Heaven's Feel. The realities of the story hit like a freight train. Unlike previous routes, Shiro fully realizes the amount he could potentially lose. But not only is that a factor, there's a mysterious supernatural force that pervades this tale, and there are sickening revelations to be uncovered. People die, allies turn into enemies, and Shiro is left to see what he had now slip through his grasp as he's powerless to stop it all from happening. With all that weight behind it, how it manages to stick the landing is what's most impressive for me. I guess it all starts with his relationship with Sakura itself, because out of all of them, this is the one with the most twists and turns. If Heaven's Feel is allegorical for sexual abuse, then Sakura is the victim, though that's sort of simplifying it. Shiro, then, is the one responsible for confronting this fact, for confronting the girl who's cheerful, innocent, and full of life on the surface, but faces demons because of her life of being used, not simply for magic due to her true lineage, but even her body, as we come to learn. Suffice to say, that's pretty major, and unlike previous challenges, this isn't something Shiro can just chuck a sword at and call it a day. It's a conflict unlike any other he's faced in past routes. He has the drive to be selfless and to help others, of course, but here, it's a problem where he has no clear answer to determine. There's Shinji to confront, sure, but due to larger circumstances, Sakura is as much an enemy to herself and others as Shinji and Zouken are, even though they are still antagonists Shiro must face against. At one point, there's even a choice you must make as to whether or not Shiro kills Sakura, which also determines whether or not he sticks to his ideals. As stated previously, Shiro loses more than he gains in this story. Not only does he lose Saber when she is absorbed by the mysterious Shadow during her fight with True Assassin, lose his arm during an engagement with the Shadow, and is even prone to literally losing his mind in the aftermath when Archer's arm replaces it, he loses his ideals when he realizes they don't work in this scenario. It starts with his love for Sakura. The romance is, thematically, the richest of all the romances we've seen. but in a way that's potentially the most twisted. Sexuality is a major element in Heaven's Feel, as already stated. A morality play of metaphors that digs so hard into the darkest side of the subject matter as much as possible without forgetting that magic is involved somewhere. Unlike before, though, sexuality is a point of genuine focus when it comes to Shiro, in a way that affects his arc. In just what way does Shiro love Sakura? On one hand, their friendly relationship is already an established element before the novel even begins. He knew her years back as an emotionally stunted, depressed middle school girl, a victim of the Mato and their way of cultivating magic by way of disgusting crestworms that violate her up to the present. Not that Shiro knew beforehand, and yes, the fact they look like dicks isn't a coincidence. Through his kindness and his teachings on cooking, they grew a genuine bond over time, and she became a more positive person as a result. In past routes, their friendship was in full effect whenever Shiro would interact with her. She's a good person, at least to him, and clearly knows him enough to understand that if he saw that she was concerned or hurt, he'd want to know why and who harmed her, creating a conflict that she doesn't want to happen. Even before Heaven's Feel, signs that she was trying to hide something were there, but never explored. They have a good thing going, a very close and positive bond. It comes to make the dramatic moments of their bond in Heaven's Feel even more gripping with how complicated it ends up being. The cheerful, innocent girl he knew isn't so innocent after all. Nay, she loathes herself underneath the heartwarming smiles and good meals she makes, being a tool for the Mato, abused and used alike, and the inevitable darkness within her leading this poor soul to cause great ruin. Of course, he'd want to help her somehow, and it would be a more straightforward story if it were any other route. But this is where the other side of the coin arises. Heaven's Feel also explores the part of Shiro that's, again, a teenage boy with raging hormones. Indeed, Heaven's Feel has the most sex scenes out of all the routes. It's even where the infamous
"Her anus is defenseless"
line comes from when Shiro has a mysterious, extremely vivid dream of having sex with a warped version of Rin in a classroom. Sex itself is further hammered in when he starts to realize just how goddamn hot Sakura has become over the years in his eyes. She's growing up and his mind just cannot ignore that, in ways that create a few disturbing implications. As the route goes on, the metaphors land home and Sakura's hidden nature as this potentially world-ending force is revealed thanks to Zoken and his crestworms of evil that violate her very being. The side of Shiro that just wants to have sex with her actually becomes a sort of moral downfall, especially since the crestworms themselves actually make Sakura lustful as well. Again, it's not a coincidence that the crestworms look like that, because as much as he wants to save Sakura because she's his friend, the other side lays a question mark in these motives that's hard to ignore. Shiro is completely selfish in Heaven's Feel, and Sakura is, after all, a victim of physical, mental, and sexual abuse when you experience the route in its uncensored, and I'd argue, the intended version. How much are his motives driven by friendship, and how much of it is pure lust? Is he really helping her, or is he contributing to her abuse by being so close as to have sex with her every time she wants to do so? Like how protecting Sakura is something that betrays his ideals because of her potential to essentially end the world, the implications of these questions make them even more of a farce in this context. Unlike the sex scenes in other routes, which purely serve to pander and titillate readers, each time they both have sex, it comes across as stages of a downfall for Shiro as a character, the abhorrent deconstruction of Shiro's very being. It's not meant to be erotic, it's disturbing when given the circumstances, and it's intentional. This is the route where his heroic ideals absolutely fail, because not only does upholding these ideals involve killing the one he loves, romantically and sexually, the sexual aspect is inherently kind of fucked up considering he's having sex with someone who's basically a mentally scarred sexual abuse victim. In the same route where it's revealed Shinji rapes Sakura and even attempts to do so again at one point, in the same route where crestworms exist and consume her, where Sakura hurts herself time and time again, physically and mentally, in an attempt to fight against the darkness within her. In the same route where it's revealed that the shadow is of her own manifestation and seeks to kill and absorb servants one after another. In the same route where her transformation into a dark being correlates with the summoning of the Greater Grail, the true Holy Grail, and, in turn, the birth of Angraminyu, a not-so-subtle allegory for illegitimate pregnancy, by the way. These sex scenes are... okay, well, they're just not comfortable. or even funny when viewed in this lens. It's just not. I mean, the sex in Fate Stay Night was previously uncomfortable and hilarious because of awful writing, but Heaven's Feel achieves a different kind. A kind of uncomfortable that has a real point behind it. Where Shiro plays the stand-in for heroic protagonists often seen in anime in the past, he may very well be his own villain here, with the dilemmas he encounters, with solutions that aren't clear, and actions that ultimately abandon heroism entirely, though how heroism would be defined in Heaven's Feel isn't clear to begin with. After all, his attempts to protect Sakura doesn't prevent her from becoming this powerful, borderline psychotic, emotionally unstable bringer of literal evil. If anything, Sakura's own love for Shiro comes to be the sort of spark that leads her to transform into someone unrecognizable as the kind girl we knew. She's absolutely obsessed with our protag, to extents that could very well label her as a yandere, much like how Rin is a tsundere, and feels guilty that she's causing him so much internal turmoil and pain through her love. It's pretty much a reverse of how Fate Stay Night conveyed romance in the Fate route. There, love represented something uplifting, positive, optimistic, or fulfilling through the bond of Shiro and Saber. Well, welcome to the polar opposite of the spectrum, where love leads to corruption, jealousy, paranoia, self-guilt, and pent-up hatred. They come forth from within the once kind heroine as the romance between the two continues, where she is antagonized by her own sister, is tormented by Shinji, loathes her own existence, and eventually accepts her hidden nature as someone who hates humanity, except for the boy she loves, where everyone wants to kill her to prevent said power from manifesting and bringing about destruction. He wants to protect her because he's driven so much by love that he no longer cares about his beliefs, knowing he's betrayed them as he does. Could there be a way to save Sakura without killing her? How? It's one of the biggest questions that's brought up, but alas, it isn't simple throughout the piling mass of circumstances that is Heaven's Feel. Of course, Heaven's Feel isn't just about Shiro. It's not just about Sakura either. It's also about Rin and her own dilemma and the story that brings out the worst in her. Rin Tosaka, the Magus who does what must be done. That part of her is on full display and could very well change a Rin fan's perspective if said fan was only familiar with her incarnations in the anime and even the past two routes, where she tends to have numerous moments of upbeat or comedic quirkiness to soften her characterization. Here, she is totally serious almost all the time, but not without reason. In fact, the reason that pushes her here is a major contributor to much of the stakes in Heaven's Feel, and leads to one of the biggest twists in the novel as a whole. Rin and Sakura are actually sisters. Those two don't exactly have the best relations, even before the novel begins. As it turns out, a family of magical lineage, especially those in high regard like the Tosaka, are only allowed to train one of their kin to be a Magus, while the other tends to stay out of that business entirely, likely to avoid dangerous magical sibling rivalry. Guess who's the older sister in this relationship? The complications grow when it's found out that the Mato, formerly known as the Makiri, are facing a drought in their lineage, being unable to produce suitable magi over time. The Tosaka, being old allies, decide to give up one of their own, and Sakura was chosen to be that adopted child, fated to embrace the harsh ways of the Mato, crestworms and all. Suffice to say, you can tell where all the tension comes from between the two, even if Rin didn't have a choice in the matter at the time. Her late father was the one who made that call. In fact, there are signs of a troubled relationship even before entering Heaven's Feel. Alas, Heaven's Feel answers why, and you learn just how much the distance between the two has not only affected Sakura, but Rin as well, despite her trying to hide behind a cold facade and seeing the situation as it is. But it isn't hard to look past this facade on the part of the reader. Looking between the lines, she feels guilty for what her sister had to go through under her stern demeanor, to be separated so she may be violated and imbued with the means to become a part of the Mato family, to fight her and potentially kill her. This was even alluded to in Unlimited Blade Works during an optional scene where Rin randomly asks Shiro what a child who's adopted against their will would feel as they grow up while in front of the Mato estate, a question that clearly relates to Sakura upon arriving at Heaven's Feel. Shiro actively tries to reconcile whatever goodness still exists between them, to understand how Rin truly feels for Sakura and to salvage the bond that's long been damaged. But it's clear that, at the end of the day, Sakura really is a danger to everyone involved. It's intensified further, however, when the darkness in Sakura begins to manifest. Now it's no longer about fighting for her family name, now she must kill her sister to prevent the destruction of the world, and when taken up front, she sorta becomes a villain in her own right in Shiro's perspective. Even when they agree to work together, it feels like they're apart, which is fitting considering the circumstances these two are pushed into. Whether or not she does decide to kill Sakura is what her arc is centered around. Is she truly as cold-hearted as she seems? Or is there still that glimmer of the Tosaka we knew before? The Rin who would be a teacher for Shiro when he needed guidance, the Rin who would risk her life to fight Berserker, the Rin who Shiro expressed his love for, the Rin who would ultimately save Shinji's life despite all he had done. Will that Rin kill her sister? To face her sister is to also face her own guilt. They're one and the same in a symbolic way. But how she deals with that guilt, how she deals with her sister, is something that defines her in this route. The ambiguity reaches a level of palpability that could make you feel as if you no longer know any of our characters anymore. Shiro is different, Sakura is different, Rin is different. Even Shinji reaches a level of sadistic, psychopathic douchebaggery that would make his incarnations in Fate and Blade Works run to the hills. He's just pure goddamn evil here. No doubt about it. With the novel delving into a severe inferiority complex at one point. Saber, the noble knight who Shiro and the reader grew to admire in Fate, is now a corrupted slave, primed to kill our main characters at the whim of Sakura and her dark power. Most of the other servants are more or less a non-factor, as they're absorbed by Sakura's own shadow and corrupted as well. The Grail War is no longer a thing of relevance, actually. There is no actual war going on by the story's apex. There is simply impending doom, and the only way to stop it is to kill someone who Shiro loves, and someone who Rin probably wishes she can rekindle with and be the sister she was supposed to be. With all this stacked on our characters, it makes one wonder if there's even an emotional anchor to keep the story from being a total downer. A bright spot or two in how Heaven's Feel inverts many elements that past routes presented in terms of who we should root for and why. You have an ambiguous tale, but one without an anchor is bound to be aimless in the end more times than not. What message could be ascertained from a story about misery besides just that? Misery with a side of sexual themes and bloodshed. Surely, if Shiro, Sakura, Rin, the Grail War, and almost every single motivation that sprung from such a conflict is to be inverted for the worst, who's to say there can't be exceptions to that rule? Is there something clear in this conflicting tale? In a lesser story, maybe not. But it's evident that thought was paid to one character in particular, who plays such unexpected importance, you begin to wonder if the surprise was intentional or a result of experimentation. That character is Ilia. Ilia is probably the greatest surprise to come from Heaven's Feel, but only because she's fleshed out to a degree that past routes never tried to accomplish. It isn't too much of a stretch to say she's the route's true heroine. What she means, what she represents in the broader narrative, is quite the powerful one. She's the emotional anchor that holds the route together. She also serves as quite possibly one of the biggest components in Shiro's arc, too. As it turns out, Ilia is, by and large, the only actual family Shiro has left in the world. What a twist! They're adopted siblings. Ilia was born from the union of Kiritsugu and her homunculi mother during the previous Grail War, who we later learned to be Iris Feel in Fate Zero. Though Shiro wouldn't know this for himself until it's too late. She's actually older than Shiro as well, despite her appearance suggesting otherwise. Heaven's Feel does its damnedest to grow Ilia and Shiro's bond to the point where it doesn't even matter that he doesn't know his last remaining family member, regardless of being adopted or not, is literally right there beside him. In the past, her anger towards Shiro was one of getting back at Kiritsugu after he, supposedly, abandoned her after the Fourth Holy Grail War a decade ago, the truth being that he couldn't return to her after he was banished for his failure to attain the Grail for the Ainsburns. What better way to take out your issues on a dad who isn't alive anymore than to do the next best thing? Kill his adopted son whom he loved so much. That'll show him. Fate and Blade Works use this motive to make her an antagonistic force, albeit to varying degrees. In Fate, this is definitely the case initially, but after Berserker is defeated and she is effectively out of the war, she turns around on her motive after Shiro, in a decision that's daring but not out of character, decides to spare her life and offer her a chance to live with him. An unexpected gesture, but one that would change her mind on the whole idea, and even show a different side to herself she never did before. A side less hostile, playful, childlike. mischievous in areas. In Blade Works, however, her role is boiled down to being a plot device during the middle of that route. She could only really show herself as an antagonist, albeit one with limited presence, and is viewed in a sympathetic lens by Shiro when she is brutally killed by Gilgamesh, and has her heart ripped out so he can use it to summon the Holy Grail. Either way, she never truly had an arc in both cases. Sure, she changed in fate when she finally began to see Shiro for the kind person he is, but Blade Works outright dispenses of her character when it's high time to create drama and backstory, showing how she and Berserker met, but nonetheless resulting in a character that didn't have the time to develop into a thematically meaningful component to the story as a whole. That all changes with Heaven's Feel. She is given much more attention this time around, and despite initially being an antagonist like before, her turnaround is not merely based on a sudden, unexpected act of kindness like in Fate. It's gradual and more proactive on Shiro's end. Sure, the two of them shared a few casual interactions in Fate before she decides to outright kidnap him, but this time around, the focus is to let her in on a personal level, for Shiro to let her experience what his own life is like firsthand, even letting her visit his home and meet some of the people he knows. It's a relationship on trust that eventually leads to her to display characteristics she never expressed before, and indeed may have had the entire time underneath her hatred. The side that deeply cares for her own adopted brother and the problems he faces. After all, the connection these two share is actually parallel. Ilya is Shiro's last remaining link to Kiritsugu, but doesn't know she is. Shiro is Ilya's only link to the father whom she loved and knows they are both adopted siblings. This also leads to Heaven's Feel making sibling bonds one of the anchors for the route in general. It's a fascinating parallel to contrast Rin and Sakura with Shiro and Ilya, where one bond can fall apart further while the other simply grows, yet both are about redemption. The redemption of one bond that's already damaged and uncertain, and the redemption of another bond founded on vengeance, with Ilya wanting to kill his own adopted brother. The bond lends itself to quite possibly one of the most beautiful moments in the entire novel. It's Shiro and Ilya walking together while she sings a German song. The presentation is magnificent here, or magnificent for Takeuchi during this 2004 to 2006 period, which drives home the fact that where Heaven's Feel is filled to the brim with ambiguity, this bond between brother and sister isn't ambiguous at all. A rare bright spot in a grim picture. It's quite possibly one of my top 5 favorite scenes from this thing, I swear to God. The way it's written and presented couldn't be more apt, unless Type Moon did a line-for-line, shot-for-shot remake of the Fate Stay Night visual novel with modern Takeuchi art. And really, this route is what makes Ilya so well regarded as a character among Type Moon fans. It's the reverse of the characterization status quo, where this story can make Shiro, Sakura, and Rin look worse in the eyes of the reader. Ilya can only make for possibly one of your favorite characters in the cast when you take what you know of her from all 3 routes. She's playful, she's mischievous, she's curious, she has a sadistic streak somewhere in there, but in the end, she cares, and her presence aims to prevent Shiro from becoming too far gone. Where he loses his way more and more as the route goes forward, Ilya stands as the one character who doesn't lose her way at all, which the climax certainly points out when she has her moment to make the sacrifice play and save everyone left to be alive. But Ilya isn't the only surprise and inverse of past conventions. Lo and behold, you have Ryder. Or rather her role in the story and just how much of a character she turns out to be. You never got to know Ryder. You never got to interact with her much. She never got much screen time outside of fights. You knew nothing about her previously, and yet here she is, a major element to the story and unambiguous at that. Something else with clarity in a muddled world. How she's handled, though, is fairly clever considering she was mostly on the sidelines up until now. With Heaven's Feel being quite the strong inverse of both Fate and Blade Works, where Ryder was just another servant to fight, the route actually subverts this very expectation. She starts off like usual, an enemy for Saber to defeat, much to Shinji's own anger. Like the beginning of Heaven's Feel itself, it seems like the same old dynamism. Until it isn't. The subversion comes later, when Shinji takes Sakura hostage to lure Shiro into the school so he can take revenge on him by beating him up for previous endeavors. But then it's revealed that Shinji wasn't at all her master the entire time, contrary to the spellbook. It's a means to control Ryder, yes, but her allegiance is revealed to be with who else but Sakura herself. The book is just an emissary for which he can bypass his adopted sister's control, and it burns away like garbage. What's astonishing thing besides the reveal of her identity and subsequent events during and after this scene is how Ryder turns out to be a missing piece the novel has been missing this entire time. It's almost as if the trio has been completed in a way, since Ryder comes to procure a position amongst the cast that's almost on the same level as Saber and Archer in terms of presence. She's a fleshed out supporting character in her own right in Heaven's Feel. Maybe not the most thematically important, but her role is one where she turns out to be an integral component to resolving the overarching dilemma. She's Sakura's servant after all, so it's natural she'd want to save her too. It also means she'd protect her no matter what, which even means killing Shiro if he does decide to kill Sakura as well. So don't do it. Ryder's motives are to the point and easy to grasp, but the moments in between, where Shiro gets the chance to interact with her in a non-hostile basis, shows there is a person underneath, and she is relatively kind in an understated way. It's just a shame the rest of her characterization is left to the sequel, Fate Hollow Ataraxia. Regardless, I wouldn't claim Ryder to be the weakest character Heaven's Feel has to offer. That honor goes to Zoken himself, though not because he's a villain with an uninteresting background. If anything, the novel does try to do something that is kinda subversive of his character in a way. His motivation is that he wants to live forever. That's what he wants the Grail for. But is it? Is it his true motivation? Or is that motivation the result of trying to achieve a different one entirely? One grounded on good intentions, but has since forgotten about that original intent throughout the centuries he's lived, killing and absorbing the bodies of others to keep his own alive at the expense of his mind. The answer is the latter. He originally wanted to bring about a peaceful world with Ilya's ancestor, whom he was in love with, mutually desiring the same utopia. Knowing he didn't have the power to attain such a world, he sought out the Holy Grail to achieve this dream, even at the expense of his beloved collaborator, as Ilya's ancestor sacrificed her own life to become the fundamentals of the Greater Grail itself, leading to the Holy Grail War as we know it. No matter how long it would take, he would continue on to fulfill this dream, and to ensure his love's sacrifice wouldn't be in vain, doing whatever he could to make it a reality. But time, madness, and his own fear of death would eventually shroud those original intentions, forgetting them entirely in his pursuit for immortality, a good motivation corrupted by time itself. It's a little subversive of his character because the simplistic motivation of seeking immortality is just a front for the one he originally had, to make his old motives the twist of his character in a way that attempts to paint him in tragedy for forgetting them in the first place. How tragic that he's become worn down, aged beyond belief, and disgusting in just about every respect, including his mindset and personality. He just lost his way as he killed and abused and killed some more. Unfortunately, that's probably the most interesting thing about his character, a man who forgot what he originally wanted. Zoken, as we know him for most of the novel, is exactly what his motivation is until it's revealed to be an unintentional fabrication, simplistic, and not at all up to the same thematic complexity as the rest of Heaven's Feel. He's an asshole villain man with gross magic, with a motive that'll involve destruction, with a role that leaves much to be desired, until the end, where it pulls the curtain and says, "No, wait! There's more!" Again, his background and the actual related tragedy of his character is neat. It's just too bad that it isn't what defines him for most of the story. Then again, it's evident that he pales in comparison to the ultimate antagonist of not only Heaven's Feel, but Fate Stay Night as a whole, Kirei. I've purposefully held off on talking about Kirei for multiple reasons. The first reason is because, like other characters, you learn more about him and the different facets of his nature one route at a time. He's a culmination. To say you know anything about Kirei based on a single route is like saying you know Sakura by watching the anime adaptations. You've scratched the surface, but there's more to delve into, more to understand. Which leads into the second reason I held off from talking about Kirei despite how important of a character he truly is. For the longest time, I didn't exactly understand what Kirei was about, what he represents. This was even the case after I finished Heaven's Feel itself, probably the route that delves into his character to completion. Yet confusion still lingered in my mind. It's not the fault of the writing, mind you, but by the very nature of Kirei's ideology. It's easy to label him as some guy who's just evil, was born to be evil, and leave it at that, which always kinda left me unsatisfied. That unsatisfaction contributed to my confusion. That can't be it, I would think to myself. There must be something about him I'm missing that makes it all sensible somehow. So I asked, what does Kirei represent? What is he all about? And I got my answer from an acquaintance and fellow Fate fan who I'll call Kat in this video. Someone who's probably a much greater fan of the franchise than I'll ever be. I wouldn't be surprised if she's done multiple complete readings of the novel, which is kind of impressive considering how long the thing is. These are mostly her words, albeit modified for clarity and structure. So the thing about Kirei is that he was pretty much born finding fascination and joy in suffering. The reason for this is a problem per se. He doesn't just act evil naturally because he was raised in a Christian environment that taught him that his way of life was wrong. It's the reason he's not like Ryunosuke per se. He kept following his religion, believing it would purify him. He kept acting the part of a good person even as it caused him no joy, and was contradictory to his nature. He follows this by getting married, believing that this would save him. However, his wife kills herself, hoping to prove to him that he'd feel sad through her death. However, all he feels is the desire to kill her himself. But wanting to value her sacrifice, he closes his mind off to those thoughts until he meets Kiritsugu, who represented everything he wanted to be, but couldn't, and would ultimately throw away the parts of himself Kirei wanted. The thing about Kirei is that he's fundamentally a good person. He just can't feel alive unless the world suffers, parallel to Shiro's own nature, and feeling bad about his fascination with suffering. He tortures and hates himself while enjoying it. It's the reason he wishes for the birth of Angramainyu. He can't find any meaning to his birth, and is hoping Angramainyu, someone literally born to be all the evils in the world, will give him his answer. His flaw is that he ultimately couldn't accept the fact that he exists. He can't stop reaching for the ideal of being a good and pure person, quote unquote, even as he acts in opposition to it. Where Shiro eventually learns to just accept the fact that he exists, Kirei has no such salvation, although his final smile may imply that he was able to apply Shiro's answer to himself. Hope that helped a bit. It did. I wish I had comprehended this before, even back when I made my original Fate Zero review, in fact. Because the third reason why I held off on talking about Kirei is because Heaven's Feel is the finale of his arc in a way. This is it. This is where the culmination of what you've learned of him in the previous two routes was heading, which is even capped off by a showdown between him and Shiro that's not only kinda cool to read, but also meaningful to what he represents in Shiro's own arc. Simply put, to the most boiled down way possible, he's his opposite. The supervillain to the superhero, the yin to the yang, the destroyer to the savior. Except that's boiling him down too much, by a fairly big margin. Where Shiro only finds purpose and self-worth in selfless acts, Kirei can only find purpose in despair, much to his own self-hatred as Kat explained, though it runs a little deeper than that in some areas. It's clear he wants to reject that natural side of him who wants to cause despair, no matter what it takes, but can never really find a way to do it that truly made him happy. This is even the reason he found Kiritsugu as some kind of fascination in the past. The part of Kiritsugu that wanted to bring world peace through the Grail and would do anything to attain such a goal attracted him, thinking he'd be able to find a reason for his own existence from him, much to his own disappointment by the end. He's an antagonist who doesn't want to be the antagonist, but can't help but be the antagonist. On one hand, and this is made up on my part, but this can kinda lend itself to be a sort of meta reading that implies an exploration of character roles in stories. Like Kirei is fated to be a villain because that's how the writer intended him to be, hence why he's literally born to be naturally bad and wants to know why. But again, it's simply an idea I just came up with. The more grounded and intended reading of his character actually comes from Kinoko Nasu himself from a translated excerpt regarding a scene in Heaven's Feel where he and Shiro meet in a Chinese restaurant while eating mapo tofu. The mapo tofu scene is one scene that makes one feel that Kirei Kotomine, who came across as unpleasant up until that point, might actually be a pretty fun guy. Although many fans of the Fate series have the wrong idea about Kotomine, it's not that he wants to see people fall or stumble. It's just that he can't feel truly alive in any other way. Fundamentally, he's a saint who performs his religious duties to a T and possesses a sense of spirituality and morality. But his greatest flaw is that if the world doesn't suffer, he can't feel truly alive. In that respect, Shiro's the same. Shiro is an upstanding person, and Kotomine is an upstanding person, but there's a fatal error in their upstanding person formatting. Ideally, this scene should serve as sort of an omen that these two are the same type of person and might actually get along. In other words, Kirei isn't so much an opposite of Shiro as much as they're the same in different ways. Shiro tries to be a good person because it's what he lives for, where Kirei tries to be a good person in an attempt to reject his true nature. So to say they're fundamental opposites is grossly understating what these two represent to each other. In a way, Shiro is what Kirei wishes he was, someone who does good for good's sake, without the question he can't find an answer to, without thinking that selflessness and virtue are empty. He actively wants this, but can't attain it alone. A soul who continually wonders about why he had to turn out this way. This is something you can only truly get when you know the full story Fate Stay Night tries to tell in regards to him. Or if you're outright told, in my case, because I'm a baka. In Fate, the basis for his role in the story is revealed when he betrays Shiro and tries to summon the corrupted Grail using a kidnapped Delia as the vessel, but is ultimately left unfinished by the time Shiro defeats him. Bladeworks continues where Fate left off in his characterization, revealing the truth of what happened to Reen's late father and, in turn, exposing more of his background. But again, he is cut short when he's ultimately killed off in a fashion that's borderline anticlimactic. It's Heaven's Field that finally ties it all together like a completed puzzle. Kirei's motivation of wanting to birth Angraminyu is in full view, literally, and he gives Shiro one hell of an enemy to fight against, though at this point he's already given up on his ideals, just like how Kiritsugu did before him. It all goes back to Shiro's idealism in the end, I suppose. We're at the endgame now. Shiro has lost his way and Kirei is on the verge of getting what he wants. Potential answers to seemingly impossible questions and to let the world's evil free. The route has completed Kirei's arc, which in turn completes Shiro's arc. Or has it? Just because one can give up on their beliefs doesn't mean they can't find new ones in their stead. After all, Saber in Fate went from yearning the Grail so much that she'd do anything to attain it, to accepting her failures, weaknesses, overcoming them, and realizing there's more to life than her own sense of duty and guilt. Reen looked out for herself, yet had a side to her that genuinely cares for others when others need help. She just needed Shiro to finally embrace that side of her, not to push it away. She changes for the better in Bladeworks. But in Heaven's Field, things seem improbable. People are dead in the wake of Sakura and Zoken's deeds, including a murdered Shinji. Saber dies by Shiro's hands in order to ensure her corrupted master's defeat, much to his despair. Shiro is losing his very mind. Reen is primed to kill her own sister with a recently projected jewel sword that harms her every time she uses it. Angraminyu is on the verge of existing. Zoken is at his lowest, being reduced to a worm due to Sakura having enough of his shit and betrays him. Even Kirei isn't trying to reject his true nature here. He's just going with the flow. Everyone is at their lowest point, and it's bound to end badly. Just when Reen goes in for the strike to end her own sister for good, Sakura retaliates in self-defense. And Reen proceeds to hug her instead. She hugs her and is seriously wounded in the process, but doesn't care about that. In a twist that shifts the paradigm, a gradually dying Reen hugs Sakura because she loves her and is sorry that she couldn't save her, to be there for when she needed her most, much to the little sister's dismay over the other's current state. For ambiguous as Heaven's Field is, for how dark the story may be and how hopeless things may seem, there are answers to this tale, and there is a message underneath the darkness of its plot. It's easy to think there's no redemption to be found when the world is bleak, or that there can't be change when you yourself or someone else have lost their way, and that you can move forward when answers are shrouded in fog. Things can change for the worst in Heaven's Field, but it can also change for the better. It isn't Shiro that saves Sakura in the end, it's Reen. Despite the intent to kill her, she just loves her sister too much to go through with it, which ultimately makes Sakura realize that not only has she suffered, her older sister has as well. She wasn't alone in the pain after all. Reen just couldn't stand to see her suffer, yet didn't know how or couldn't make things right despite this. But instead of rejecting this guilt, she finally embraces and accepts it, which in turn leads to sparing her sister's life, admitting her own faults and said guilt, completing her arc, and makes Sakura Sakura finally resists the darkness within herself after this opened her eyes to all the wrong she's done, saving her in a way Shiro couldn't. Zoken fails to achieve immortality, but is reminded of the old self he had forgotten because of Ilia, the self that was driven by ideals and aspirations, not fear and madness, and finally accepts death. Kirei is ultimately defeated when his body gives out after Sakura tore out his artificial heart earlier in the route, but instead of disappointment or anger, he just accepts his defeat, being able to be free of the burden that is his own existence, regardless of whether or not he got the answer he was looking for. It's an oddly sympathetic moment that shows just how rounded of a guy he really was. But the thing Heaven's Feel makes a point of, one relevant to Shiro's arc, is that just because his ideals don't work within the framework of its ambiguous plot, doesn't mean he can't ever have new ideals, maybe ones that are more realistic or healthier than simply being a slave to pure idealism. It's true that Shiro loses more than he gains, but what he gains, despite the deep losses, is a renewed sense of worth and a reason to live for himself in the aftermath. Shiro's body ends up destroyed, but before his soul meets the same end, Ilia, his last remaining family left, makes the sacrifice and destroys Angra Mainyu, saving Shiro's soul to be used for a new body and the life he wanted, his life with Sakura. So, in a way, he never gave up on idealism, only that he left his old ideals behind, with a new reason to live, and someone to be a good person for. In the end, Heaven's Feel's message isn't one of doom and gloom despite the doom and gloom. It uses it all to create ambiguity for the purpose of its single encapsulating message that, even within darkness, there can be forgiveness, change, acceptance, and love past the troubles and hardships almost each and every character goes through in one way or another. In fact, Fate Stay Night, looking past the drama, action, and horror, is a novel that lends itself to some of the most hopeful stories one could ever experience. From Fate's story of two damaged people overcoming their weaknesses and obstacles, finding whole new reasons to view life itself and move on, to Unlimited Blade Works exploring the value of selflessness and the way Shiro affects Reen's outlook on how she views the world, to Heaven's Feel saying that forgiveness, change, and love is still able to shine through, even in the darkest of times. The true end of Heaven's Feel even climaxes on a tangibly human note that resolves Shiro's, Sakura's, and Reen's arc all at once in a way where they've learned something, which you wouldn't expect considering most of what came before it. The Fate epilogue in Real Tenua is a borderline tearjerker for anyone who's wished for Shiro and Saber to have a happy ending, with the music, the imagery, and the writing showcasing just how much the novel doesn't want to depress you, but to inspire somehow, in its own way. It's one of the greatest epilogues I've ever seen or read. Even the Taiga dojos feed into Fate Stay Night's core identity, showing that a novel as serious and dramatic as this is still able to make fun of itself. Fate Stay Night isn't a hopeless visual novel, but quite possibly one of the most optimistic and meaningful in the long run. And it's this aspect that has made me better appreciate the series as a whole in ways the anime's never accomplished. Which leads back to a previous video I made last year regarding a topic I still think about to this day. How do you get into Fate when you've never experienced it before? That video was mainly about a casual anime viewing audience, but I suppose the same can be said for those who actively try to keep up with the medium as a whole. What is the ideal way to get into the franchise I hold so dear? The answer I came to was that there was none, that each method of doing so had its own pros and cons, and that there isn't an easy way to get into any of them without exposing yourself to said cons. That was before I read and finished the visual novel, admittedly, before going through all those words and finishing it with the Fate epilogue that I absolutely adore now. Hardcore Fate fans say you should go with the novel to get into Fate, as it's the true story, so to speak. I agree with this sentiment. Fate Stay Night, the visual novel, is quite easily the most enriching and complete way of experiencing any of the three routes as Kinako Nasu and Takashi Takeuchi intended. It's where you understand Shiro the most, it's where you explore the world the most, it's where you engross yourself into the drama the most because of just how detailed it's described. It's where character arcs make the most sense. It's where Nasu's talent for horror writing shines, and it's where emotions are at their highest and their lowest, as each paragraph paints a metaphorical canvas with fan-translated prose that may or may not be entirely on point, but gets the job done anyway. It is the definitive Fate Stay Night experience, 800,000 or so words and all, but just because it's definitive doesn't mean it's ideal for anyone who's never been exposed to this series. I still stick by my original consensus I made in that video. Even after going through all the routes of Fate Stay Night, I still think there's no ideal way to actually get into this franchise that is easily accessible, yet whole, and represents the intended experience and meaning without needing to read the complete visual novel to understand its true power as a piece of visual literature. Minus the terrible sex scenes. The visual novel is very long, and even those who decide to commit to it will find it takes a while for each route to really pick up steam, especially the Fate route, which may actually be the longest in terms of word count, edging out Heaven's Feel by a slight difference. Fate 2006 is a bad adaptation despite the virtues I now find in it after reading the novel. Dean's Blade Works is pitiful, easily the worst adaptation of this material and should be avoided. Fate Zero, though not the subject of this video, spoils important things in its chronological sequel, and Ufotable's crack at the Bladeworks material does the opposite, ensuring that seeing one will spoil the other. And now Heaven's Feel is going through the adaptation machine, with part 1 available to watch, albeit with changes of a fairly substantial margin due to being films. Will there ever be an ideal way for a newcomer to begin their journey through Fate in a way that'll make them understand why it's so beloved by those who've read through its contents? I can only suggest ideas, but as of now, I don't think so. Then again, these are only my thoughts with my perspective alone. The Fate series is something that'll stick with me for a long time. It's not a fad in my eyes, something that'll wear out with time, but something that has come to define me, like how Star Wars can stick with someone throughout their life, whether in a way that's healthy or not. I am a fan of Fate Stay Night. I am a fan of the Nasuverse. I'm a fan of Type Moon. I've never read Tsukihime, and my experience with Kara no Kyokai is limited to the films and not the novels, but it's only a matter of time before I get around to those as well. Finishing Fate Stay Night was worthwhile in more ways than one, providing thrills, chills, surprises, doubt, sorrow, and happiness with its writing. Shiro, Saber, Rin, Sakura, Ilya, Kirei, Ryder, and so on. These characters are now stuck with me, as they have for those who've gone deeper than I did. There isn't an ideal way of knowing exactly what I'm talking about, only that there is the best way. There's a difference between the two connotations, if you ask me. After all that reading, I grew to feel like I really did experience something grand, something that Kinako Nasu wanted me to experience. And maybe you can too if you've watched this far and you've never given the visual novel a whirl. I'd say give it a whirl. Find the patches needed to translate it into English and add the option to uncensor it, and read the Fate Stay Night you've missed out on. Because for how dark it can be, for how macabre it can be, for how depressed or conflicted our characters can be at their lowest points, for how many questions it could pose, and how much action it has and how uncertain it can seem, Fate Stay Night has a lot of heart. That heart, the heart that lies at its core, is what makes the visual novel last.
Hi. おかえりなさい。